Welcome to New Ways, New Habits podcast, hosted by change behaviour experts T3 and Kiddy & Partners.
And if you don't know who we are, we offer leadership and behavioural change products and services to multinational companies, large public sector organisations and SMEs within the UK and globally. I'm Paul Tizard.
And I'm Eleanor Boniface. And we will be your hosts for the upcoming podcasts, where we will bring voices of these experts to you directly to give you insightful and innovative updates on all aspects of the world of people and organisational development.
In this series, we'll be looking at the future and macro trends that are and will be driving culture and ways of working. And what are the conversations and decisions that leaders need to make to take advantage of those opportunities?
So to kickstart the series, we're joined by Anthony, our principal consultant. To give our listeners some background, could you tell us a bit about why looking to the future and macro trends is important to you?
Yeah, thanks. So I've been working in culture and engagement for around about 10 years now with, a variety of across sectors and across the world. And one thing that I notice, a trend, if you will, is that many leaders and organizations struggle to sometimes understand what's happening within their own organization. Obviously, that's where we come in as consultants, let alone what's happening within more broadly within their own sector or industry. But actually, there's real value in being able to look beyond that. So what's happening in other industries, other sectors, technologies, trends of all kinds, and that's why I think it's fundamental. There are lots of really great trends and foresights advisories. Future Lab's a great one. Trend watching is another great one. But what I notice is that fundamentally they tend to be consumer and marketing focused. And actually what I'm really interested in is how those trends then translate into the way we work, strategy, the way that we're going to be working, business models, etc. As we move on. So that's the stuff that really gets my fingers tingling, as it were.
Yeah, nice. So clearly, the debate around office, remote and hybrid working has been going on for some time, and especially post-pandemic. So why is it still such a hot topic?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're talking about this as a trend that's coming down the line, but actually we've been having this conversation certainly it's become more heated post-pandemic, but actually it's something that I've been exploring with clients, pre that time. I mean, the reality is that we've seen the biggest changes to ways of working since the Industrial Revolution, and we're only 2 or 3 years into this kind of societal experiment, as it were. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that because we're still new into this experiment over the last couple of years, of course, organizations and leaders want certainty and they want solutions. They want the answer. But that solution isn't there yet. But what we're seeing is, I'm sure you guys have seen it with your own clients, is that in the absence of that certainty, leaders are becoming uncomfortable with the ambiguity around these conversations. So we're sort of seeing a kind of mandated return to the office, or a fixed flexible is something I saw recently, which is an absolute contradiction in terms, which is the idea that, right, you don't have to come into the office all the time, but you do need to all come in on Tuesday mornings and Wednesday afternoons, or some such gubbins like that. And that's the reality, is no one's nailed hybrid yet. It's still emerging. But we have to avoid this kind of sense that I'm seeing from some organizations, which is an almost headmasterly attitude, which is, right, it's not working. You've ruined it for everyone. Right, all in the office all the time.
And why do you think that is? What do you think drives that?
And this is where it's really interesting to look at the kind of business world that's happening, but also beyond that, the kind of broader trends and a bit of history behind that. So some of that is about justifying pre-COVID real estate decisions, right? So, people that have taken out 10-year leases on offices in the city, or have invested in building, and now those offices are sat, if they're lucky, they're 60% full some of the week, but quite often they're kind of 10 to 30% full, for a little bit time of the month. and that's costly, right? Just the cost of keeping the lights on in the offices. And underlying that is that we need to have a real conversation to reevaluate what is the purpose of the office. Yeah, it is fundamentally changed from what it was created for. And what we're looking to do is sort of unpick 150 years worth of attitudes, mindsets, processes, systems, all of those things that need to be unpicked so we can actually start to plan for the future rather than go, how can we get back to the past? And the one that really sticks for me is this outdated and totally debunked myth that presenteeism equals productivity, and there's plenty of stats around that.
Well, you give us some stat bombs, and you've mentioned stats.
Yeah, very good. So that we know that the attraction and retention of best in class talent is a challenge for all organizations and all sectors at the moment, and engagement lies right at the heart of that. And so, and to prove that, so the Gallup State of the Workplace report, this published this year, showed that companies with an engaged workforce are 21% higher in their profitability and 17% higher in their productivity. Yeah. ADP research shows, and this has been around for a couple of years and still sticks, that 64% of employees would consider leaving their job if they had to return to the office full time. And that doesn't, and that doesn't even cover the fact, and this is another Gallup stat, that in the UK, it reckons that 59% of employees are quiet quitting, right? So you play that next to the productivity and profitability piece, that's pretty stark. And then the last one for now is a Scoop report which came out in Forbes only a couple of weeks ago, showed that companies who have fully flexible work practices have 21% higher revenue growth rate, and those with restrictive practices, that growth rate is reduced to 5%. So the reality is, hybrid is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, and we have to find a way to work out what is the best of both worlds rather than what is the worst. And I think that's what people are struggling with at the moment.
There's some really interesting stats actually, because I wouldn't have expected some of them to be as high as maybe as what they are. And the other thing that I find interesting is, the ownership of decisions is almost put onto the leaders and the organizations, but what about the people who are actually working? Because, only speaking from my experience here, I prefer having the social side. I like that. I think it definitely adds to the culture, and I think it's really difficult to have culture without it. But from day to day, people are going to change their minds about how they feel, if they want to be in the office, if they don't. So I think there has to be some accountability on people within the organization, and maybe more consultation around that. But it must be really hard for organizations to know what the right and wrong thing to do are, because it almost does change so quickly, and people's lifestyles and mindsets change rapidly, especially at different times of the year, or kind of what we're experiencing, and what's going on outside of the workplace as well, and how that's affecting how we're thinking.
Yeah, you're spot on. So there's a couple of things to sort of pick out of that, which is one of the things that we have with hybrid working now is that we can't expect culture to happen by osmosis anymore, right? It used to be that your company culture would be the way you'd experience it because you'd be in the office the majority of time and you'd see it in the way people speak, the actions they take. They wouldn't use a certain photocopier because that was the special photocopy. All those kind of little systems and process that kind of denote like the way we do things around here. And actually, in this hybrid and remote and flexible environment, organizations have to be more choiceful and mindful and meaningful about culture. Yeah, it's something that they have to actively look to shape. And I use the word shape specifically because you don't create culture; it exists. You can only shape it. And the other point that's within that is that this isn't a one conversation and done. Right? This is continuously emerging, this new way of working. And if anyone tells you they know have the answer to hybrid, they're lying, because they don't, because it's still it's still figuring itself out. And you're absolutely right. It's not just leaders making those decisions. It has to act in consultation. And one of the things that actually comes up in the kind of key takeaways is that actually this needs to be an ongoing conversation, and it actually probably needs to be more localized conversation, because what is equal and fair for one team within an organization in terms of remote and flexible, and fundamentally what they're able to deliver, right? Because this isn't just I want to work from home because I like listening to records and looking out the window half the day. It's about, what am I outputting? How am I contributing, in terms of performance, but in terms of collaboration? And then there'll be other areas of the business who may be more customer facing, who may need to be working core hours, where the same remote, flexible, hybrid kind of guidelines won't work for those. And we have to sort of have a conversation between the difference between equality and what's equitable in those circumstances.
I mean, it's super complicated, isn't it? Because you've got people that, some people, like for us, we have the luxury that we can do our work like that. A lot of people had no choice, even during the pandemic. They still had to go out and do their stuff. I'm more concerned about the office party, because now if that's going to be, instead of that being a continuation of some sort of relationships you might have built during the year, that's now going to be done on a Tuesday, if that's the day that you come in, or remotely. So that's going to have an impact. But I think I want to take you back to something that you said earlier, which was around about the office. And I'm curious about what is the office for then now?
Yeah, so it's worth just revisiting, like, what was the office for, right? How did the office come around? And the makeup of the office, the design of the office, is basically comes from the industrial age, where everyone was working. The majority of the workforce were working in factories. So if you look at a picture of factories from the Industrial Revolution or the turn of the previous century, where we were being paid for our physical labor rather than our intellectual capability, you'll see rows of people lined up in essentially it would be whoever's fitting that part together, that would all be lined up in a row, then that would be passed to the next row. And what that allowed was, it meant supervisors could stand at the end of a row and see what was happening and making sure everything was happening as it should be. Or they'd have an office where they could occasionally hide themselves from the noise of the workers and go and focus. And then what happened was that as we moved into the kind of more stop being paid for what we did with our hands, offices still maintained that same physical design. So if you look at pictures of offices from the 50s, 60s, 70s, you'll see rows of desks all lined up. You'll see typing pools, and it'll be people. Finance will be sat in one office, and they'd all be lined up in one row, and it'd be legal in another, and another department in another.
Oh, the good old days, eh, Anthony?
the good old days. And the supervisor would have his own office, who we would occasionally come out and do those things. And there was a need for that. Some of that was to do with economies of scale. Some of that was to do with the equipment that was required to do those jobs, whether that be industrial, or if you think back to typewriters, and, for those of us old enough to remember desktops, those things were, largely cost prohibitive for individuals to own, to take home, and so they would exist in the office. But we don't have that anymore. We have laptops, we have internet, those things. So actually the need to be lined up in rows doing work where we can be supervised simply doesn't exist anymore. And actually it's it's shown to be counterproductive. And then couple into that, I think I mentioned around about what the office represents. So, and this is interesting. You were talking about the office party, but actually, when we think of the workplace, if we think of factories where they were a community, right? So everyone within a local area would probably live close to the factory. Okay, the kids would all go to the same school. They'd live in the same streets. The klaxon would go off. I used to live in Cumbria, not so far from Barrow, right? And the klaxon would go off at a certain time, and all the men would come out their cottages, and they would all go to work at the same time. They'd have factory fortnights, so they'd all go on holiday at the same time. But the reality is, if you live in London, those offices aren't built near where people live.
No.
In the city, people have to commute 90 minutes to 2 hours to live with that, and the people that can afford to live near those workplaces probably aren't coming into the workplace every day because they're dialing in from their yacht or from the Surrey Hills. So fundamentally that's changed, right? So offices aren't built.
I think it's really interesting because what I'm hearing is that the office, what the purposes of it represent, are about experience. And if we just take a look at the retail industry, for example, and you look at, over the pandemic, online shopping became a much bigger thing, and companies in retail had to massively change their structure. But if you look at how people are shopping now, people want to go into shops, and they want to have the customer experience. They like that, and so then they've had to reinvent it yet again. Do you think there's almost, if you kind of look at that and then you look at what the office purpose is, do you think that potentially it could, maybe leaders or organizations are thinking, oh, it could go back to the fact that people want the experience, or that's what they get from the office, rather than it being, an archaic representation, but instead maybe they could adapt it to how people are working nowadays, and maybe that's what we should be talking about, rather than whether you should be or shouldn't be in the office. It's more about what experience is best for the people to make them happy, for then you to get the productivity, performance, etc.
100%. And that's why a lot of organizations are focusing on employee value proposition and employee experience, because actually, let's reevaluate what the office is for now. And like I said before, people want to be productive. They want to perform, right? They want to be part of a community. They want to be doing great work. I've got some. I like to have stats at hand because I inherently feel that
we love stats.
Well, and what it is because I inherently feel these things. I know these things. I experience these things to be true. But of course, when you're speaking to clients and organizations need to see a bit more than me saying, I think it's a good idea because it feels right.
Yeah, so you're clearly proving you're right to be on anybody's quiz team.
Yes. So Culture Amp did some interesting research, and it shows that the difference between the way execs measure productivity to the way most of the workforce wants their productivity to be measured. Execs still have 27% of them still have visibility as a key measurement of productivity and performance. Yeah. Next to that, 19% is achieving KPIs and goals. Now, achieving KPIs and goals is important for any business and for any person who's thinking of their reward, their progression, etc. Now, actually, the interesting thing is that for the rest of the workforce, 27% of them, the highest percent of them, wanted to be measured by KPIs and goals. So what they're producing, not where they're producing it, coupled with, and this brings us back to this piece around culture and experience and conversations, the highest after that was 17% want to be measured by the conversations they have with their leaders and their team and what's being produced.
Just on the visibility section there, or area, I find that spectacular, because if I think about it, in a virtual setting, it's almost like you need to be seen more, so you end up being on a lot of meetings.
Yes.
And how many people are dragged into meetings that they're unnecessarily on to be seen, when they could be being more productive doing their work rather than being in a meeting? So that's an interesting one for me.
And also during the pandemic, how many times were you dialed in to meetings? You were doing your work, you were kind of getting on with stuff, and then said, I remember it happening so often. I thought, what's going on here? And I think that presenteeism was still there.
Yeah, and fundamentally, the cornerstone of all this is trust.
Yes.
Right, which is trusting that people are doing what's right. So I can't remember if I mentioned before, but so I've been working remote and hybrid for 7 years now, long before it became cool and trendy, right? And I think when I was working with clients previous to that, that was one of their biggest fears, was people actually getting on with work. And I think one of the interesting things with that is that people assumed when they got to working from home again that, brilliant, I'm not going to, I'll be able to get on with stuff. There won't be any meetings. But actually, it was quite the opposite, because suddenly what would have been a 5-minute conversation over a coffee suddenly became a default 3/4 of an hour Teams meeting. And that's, and I think when we look at what the office is for now, a lot of the challenges that people have been exacerbated by hybrid remote working actually existed in the physical world, right? So the big blockers to productivity and performance, from a performance, and again, so a couple of more stats, but it's just useful, comes from Gartner, right? Which is the biggest challenges to productivity in a hybrid working: collaborating with other teams. 35% of people had that as their tops. Staying aware of one another's work. Now that's a challenge, right? Knowing how much work is duplicated, or someone's doing some amazing work, in another department, but you're just not aware of it. So you're recreating it or reinventing the wheel. Third is communicating ideas and strategy. And the final one is staying aligned. Now I would argue they were challenges even when we were all in the
I was going to say that, which is, at what point was this done? Because I know that over the years of being a consultant, I've been asked to help with these things long before we were doing the remote stuff.
And I wonder, my curiosity as this conversation emerges is that, sure, some of these topics, some of these challenges have been amplified or exacerbated by hybrid. But also, I do wonder sometimes if hybrid is the excuse, is the stick with which we beat every problem over the head with, and I just don't believe that's true.
So, I mean, the thing for me is that if I was listening to this now, I'd be thinking, okay, so this is some interesting stuff. There's some great stats. What's the main sort of takeaways that leaders need to be thinking about in terms of things that they can move towards, blockers they need to overcome, that sort of stuff? Yeah,
certainly. So I'm going to roll through these pretty quickly because I know that we're heading to time. So bad tech. All right, that's not just, it's more than just a mild irritant. All right, it's a real blocker to performance and productivity. It's difficult to encourage people to come into the office when their Wi-Fi speed is higher at home. There's a simple one. And as we start to move into people using AI, more generative stuff, as our the demands of our technology and our use of technology is increasing within work, our tech and our tech capability and investment needs to match that. Second of all, it's about creating spaces that allow productivity and communication. I think one of the challenges is that many people of generational cohorts comes into this. A lot of people are coming into the office because it's a time where they can be quiet, because if they work from home, they might have kids around. There might be other people working from home. The office is a place of focus, quiet, and solitude, as it were. Other people are coming into the office because they want to have conversations, look people into the eye. They want to brainstorm. They want to.
Yes, I've met them. Yes, I try to avoid them, but they're everywhere.
And here's a fascinating one. 33% of people, this is from Envoy, 33% of people cited chatty co-workers as a reason to not come into the office.
Oh no, people would avoid me.
That's exactly the reason I'm coming into the office.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm leaving.
But again, does generation come? Generation comes into that.
Yeah, 100%. So we're approaching a time now where we're going to have 5 generations in the workforce at any one time. Okay, and life stages plays a massive part in that. So particularly, and I think generational cohorts can be a lazy summing up of people sometimes. But if we look at Gen Zs and Gen Alphas coming into the workplace, if you move to a new city or a new job, you're early on during your career, your workplace is part of your social circle, and it's part of a community, and it provides you the opportunity to learn by osmosis. I remember when I became a consultant, I learned so much by hearing the conversations other people were having, being able to go and sit in things, let alone just the kind of, and there is some research which I don't have at hand, so you'd be thankful there's not a stat bomb coming here. The actual well-being attitudes of people who are working remotely and working from home long term. But similarly, as people get different responsibilities that go through life stages, caring for children, caring for elderly parents, actually for them being able to work remotely becomes more valuable to them. And so what we have to overcome, and people do like guidelines, by the way, they don't like to be left totally to their own devices. If anyone remembers the kind of the ill-conceived Netflix, we won't give you holiday allowance, take whatever you want. They found no one was taking holiday, right? Because people like guidelines. And it's the same with this in terms of that. I've seen amazing offices in amazing locations that when you walk in, it could be a row of desks anywhere in the world. And what you see is people have come into the office to collaborate, communicate, be part of a community, and they're all speaking to people on Zoom calls or meetings calls to people who haven't come into the office.
That's so true.
And unfortunately, the separation between that tends to be line managers, senior managers who are at a stage in their life where they have those other caring responsibilities, and they're exactly the people that we need to be finding ways to do that learning osmosis. So as I get the wrap up eyes, I've 3 key takeaways, I guess, is the thing that you're after. So, number 1, there is no silver bullet to this. It requires organizations to have adult-to-adult conversations and to co-design those guidelines and what that looks like. Point 2, as I've already just mentioned, people want guidelines. Yeah, they need guidelines. They want to know what they're signing up for, and they want to know how those decisions were made. And thirdly, based around, the idea of commuting, and so much of this is about societal change, the distribution of wealth crisis, the cost of mortgages, rents, travel, all of those things play into this. So I think what we're going to start to see is more localized conversations. I'm not saying we're returning to the cottage industry, but it requires leaders to have more localized conversations with teams to work out what are the guidelines that they need, how can they perform and be productive as to what needs them. And, as a broader kind of societal shift, I think we'll start to see less global hubs and more regional hubs for organizations, simply because it'll start to become more affordable, become more sustainable. Actually, as we start to look into things like 15-minute cities, and I mean the truest sense of that, not the kind of far right and far left take on that, actually that's going to be necessary.
That's great. I think there's a lot that our listeners can take away from that and take back to their own organizations and start having the conversations. And that's really where we're coming from, isn't it? Let's emerge these conversations and take it away and really think about what's right for the environment.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the fact that it's so easy to make assumptions around. So the fact, just having the conversations, flagging this is a thing, it's not, this is a new thing, this is not something we're all used to, that just giving permission for it to continue, that it's not a done deal and that everyone's got it sussed. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for providing us with all of your experience and kind of insights into this debate and how those macro trends are playing a part in the modern day of working. It's been fantastically interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the stat bombs as well, particularly those.
Yes.
It's really nice to think of all this different research that backs it up too. So thank you.
Real pleasure. Look forward to speaking again soon.
So thank you for listening to our podcast, New Ways, New Habits. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, we'll be joined by Anthony for part 2, where we'll be discussing... What are we going to discuss, Anthony?
We'll be discussing the future of work and the post-purpose scenario.
Ooh, here we go.
So to find out the release date, follow us on LinkedIn, and you can find all future podcasts on Spotify, SoundCloud and Apple, We really are the whole package.
And it wouldn't be right without saying, don't forget to provoke, plant and practice these new ways and new habits.